Hello again. This is Dr. Arroyo, and I would like to continue our reading of the book entitled Jesus MD by Dr. David Stevens. Now, today we are going to proceed to the first chapter, and it's entitled Panga Sunday. Panga is the Swahili word for machete. I knew that, and I knew other tribes used the same word because of my wife Jody. And I had just recently finished 6 months of Kipsigis language school and were serving our first term with World Gospel Mission at Tenwek Hospital in the beautiful highlands of the Kericho district in southwestern Kenya. At age 30, after years of planning, praying, and preparing, and after packing up my young family and moving 8,000 miles away from home, I felt excited to have finally begun my life's work as a missionary doctor. I was still very much a rookie. But on this particular Sunday, I happened to be the senior physician on duty at the hospital. The older doctors were gone, thus I would be expected to handle on my own any emergencies or medical crises that arose. Since I had done my residency in family practice, I felt capable of dealing with the vast majority of routine cases I had encountered since my arrival at Tenwek just months before. But I confess to feeling a little leery about what surgical emergencies might come in the door during the absence of my more experienced colleagues. That day, my worst nightmare came true. Sundays were always different from the normal daily routine. As the doctor on call, I had seen the sickest patients, examined new admissions, and checked the maternity ward for problems. I missed church and got home late for lunch, hoping to catch up on a little correspondence. It was about 4 o'clock on a sunny afternoon when the call came from the hospital saying we just received a trauma patient who needed immediate surgery, something about a panga wound. I sprinted up the hill through the compound to the hospital, arriving at the OR short of breath and from the high altitude and totally unprepared for what I saw in front of me. A 40-year-old Kipsigis man, covered in blood, was lying on the operating table. The blood from a machete had caught him across the bridge of his nose and sliced all the way across through his face, down to the bottom of his jaw. His face had been literally cut in two, with the lower half peeling forward and lying on his chest. The patient was in shock and struggling for breath. Amazed that the man hadn't bled out and died on his way to the hospital, I gave orders to mobilize what we at Tenwek referred to as our walking blood bank. That is, we put out a call for any missionaries or hospital staff on the compound with matching blood type to quickly donate enough blood to save this patient. Meantime, the nurse had started an IV and fluids were running wide open. I ordered a second IV in the other arm, and as I worked to secure his airway, because the patient was in danger of choking to death from blood and his own secretions. The quickest and easiest thing would have been to intubate him, but that would have required placing an endotracheal tube into his throat right through the middle of his gaping wound. I had no choice but to perform my second emergency tracheostomy ever. No small challenge without proper anesthesia or instruments. I breathed a big sigh of relief once I cut open his neck, placed the tube directly into the trachea, and saw the patient immediately begin breathing more easily. As soon, as soon as we got the man stabilized, I literally ran from the OR to the doctor's office, a closet-sized room where we kept the hospital's medical library. I didn't even know what to call this type of wound, but it probably wasn't in any index anyway. I grabbed for our orthopedic atlas and hurriedly thumbed through pictures and diagrams, searching for something that looked like my patient's case. It was time to do what we often call on the mission field a little cookbook surgery. For some reason, American medical texts don't contain much about machete wounds of the face. The closest thing I could find was in an orthopedic text showing a diagram for repairing different types of maxilla upper jaw fractures. Lefort type fractures are facial injuries that occur most often in automobile accidents where people are smashed into the dash so violently that the maxilla is fractured all the way across their cheekbones. Actually, the textbook diagram I found only showed bones separated less than a quarter of an inch, so they didn't look much like my patient, whose entire face was lying open. The similarity was in the fact that these Lefort fractures also resulted in a separation of facial bones and required literally pulling those bones and the face back together. Decided this, Deciding this was probably as close as an example as I was going to find, I started reading the text even as I rushed back to surgery. By the time I walked into the OR, however, I realized I hadn't found a solution, but merely defined the problem. What good is a cookbook if you lack the ingredients? The first step mentioned in the text was to wire the upper and lower teeth together with arch bars. I had never seen a set of arch bars, let alone applied them. I showed the nurse the picture, and she had never seen arch bars either, and sent her to the hospital storage room on the slim chance she could find the set, or at least uncover something else. Anything we might use to make do. Then I propped the text open on a stand beside the operating table and began looking back and forth between my patient and the pictures in the book to decide where and how to start putting this man's face back together. I knew if I didn't, he would certainly die. About that time, things went from bad to worse as the outpatient staff almost in a panic, wheeled in a second victim. The same attacker had taken his panga to the 20-some-year-old nephew of my first patient. The younger man's right arm had been almost completely severed just above the wrist, and another blow had chopped through the bone in the upper left arm, leaving it attached only by a bit of skin and muscle. He'd also suffered deep wounds to his neck and 3 or 4 more blows to the head, blows that had gone through both tables of the skull. Yet he was barely breathing and had no measurable blood pressure after being transported over who knows how many miles of rough roads. Now I had 2 critical patients desperately needing emergency surgery in just one operating room, and I was the only doctor on duty. Fortunately, there was one other MD at the mission that day, so I sent for him. He arrived within minutes and immediately pitched in to help. Unfortunately, he was never to the field than I was. He was newer to the field than I was. Never in my short professional life had I felt so aware of my own inadequacy as I did standing at the OR between these 2 patients. I had long dreamed of coming to Africa and perhaps earning a reputation as a modern-day David Livingstone. I naively envisioned becoming a medical superhero who could save his patients' lives and their souls single-handedly and simultaneously. I had worked and studied to become a missionary doctor for years. I had attended and graduated with honors from a Christian college with a widely respected pre-med program. I had been in the top 5% of my medical school class. I chose one of the largest and best family practice residency programs in the country to receive the breadth of experience I thought would be the most helpful when I got to Africa. My final year of residency, I even gained valuable administrative experience when I was named chief resident in our 40 resident program. By the time I left for the mission field, I was prepared for anything, or so I thought. But nothing in my training or experience had adequately prepared me for Panga Sunday. I learned a lot about trusting God that day as I operated on those 2 men for the next 8 hours. I used surgical procedures I'd never seen, let alone performed. Any stateside trauma center receiving patients like those would have mobilized more specialists than could have fit in our operating room. At Tenwak, on Panga Sunday, there was no one else to call. We put in a central venous line and pumped both fluids and donated blood into the second patient to re-establish pressure. There was nothing to be done with his arms except to complete the amputations. Carefully sew up the stumps and quickly control the bleeding in his other wounds. As my colleague worked on this fellow, I concentrated my attention on the first patient. The nurse I had sent on to a desperate scavenger hunt actually found a set of arch bars in our storage area. Whoever had donated them to our mission hospital never realized how desperately they would be needed. God has answered my prayer. Using our limited dental and orthopedic instruments, I wired one bar to the upper teeth and one to the lower, one tooth at a time. I then wired the two arch bars together. By that time, I was already worn out, but I wasn't half done. The more difficult part of the procedure lay ahead. How could I elevate the lower face back onto place when we lacked the instruments needed? Necessity is the mother of invention. Should be emblazoned on the operating room wall of every mission hospital. The test book showed what I needed to do was to wire the lower face to the bone above the eye, the supraorbital ridge, in order to anchor everything in place. That required running a wire from the arch bars up through the side of the face just under the skin to where I could feed it into a small hole. I would have to drill through the bone at the outside of each eye socket and tie the wire off. Sounds simple when you put it in one sentence, but I knew it was going to take hours for me to complete the procedure. Problem number 1. I lacked the surgical instruments needed to ream out a small tunnel in the subcutaneous tissue of the face, through which I could then thread the wire from the jaw up to the supraorbital ridge. How could I do that? I thought of a surgical gadget we had called a hemovac, or small cylindrical device used to suction blood during abdominal surgery. The hemovac has a sharp metal attachment called a trocar, about 6 inches long and a quarter inch in diameter. It looks a little like a thick meat skewer. A trocar is typically used to make a hole through the abdominal wall and the surrounding tissue in order to insert a small drainage tube after intestinal trauma. The trocar proved to be just what I needed. I tunneled it through the subcutaneous tissue of the cheek up to the supraorbital ridge, then threaded the wire through the resulting tunnel and tied into the bone where I had drilled a small hole. After finally approximating the bones and snugging the two halves of the man's face into place again, I began sewing the tissue back together, beginning deep inside and slowly closing the wound as I worked my way to the surface. By the time I finished operating around midnight, I was totally exhausted. The physical strain was surpassed by the mental fatigue caused from having had to wear so many different medical hats. I had started in the role of ER doctor, resuscitating and stabilizing my patient. I then had to administer and monitor the anesthesia on my own patient while operating. I fulfilled the role of dentist and oral surgeon to reconstruct a workable jaw and align my patient's teeth. I performed my first maxillofacial surgery using orthopedic surgery textbook photos and diagrams to repair and reposition the man's face. When I finally closed the man's wound, I used all the plastic surgery techniques I ever remembered studying in hopes of limiting the scarring. But when I finished with patient number one, the second man remained comatose. Worried that he hadn't regained consciousness, I examined his pupils. One was more dilated than the other, indicating what I had already feared, a subdural hematoma. He was bleeding inside his skull, and accumulating blood was putting pressure on his brain. Unless the pressure was relieved, it would herniate his brain stem. If that happened, as the brain itself was forced down into the narrow opening at the base of the skull, the man's entire nervous system would be constricted to the point that everything, even the involuntary systems, could shut off. His breathing would stop and the patient would die. I knew the technique for relieving intracranial pressure, though I had never seen or performed the procedure. So after everything else I had done that day, I got my first experience in neurosurgery without a brain surgeon or even a CT scan to guide me. Step 1 was to cut through the scalp and fold back a half circular flap of skin to expose the skull over the spot of the suspected bleeding and blood clot. Next, I had to drill my first ever bore hole through the skull itself using handheld surgical drill that looked more like a huge auger my grandfather might have used to do woodworking back in the days before the Black & Decker power tools. The trick was to carefully apply just enough pressure for the very sharp but rounded metal bit to bore slowly and steadily through bone without also penetrating the dura, the covering of the brain, and sinking into the brain itself. There was no room for error. When I successfully completed the drilling, the first hole, blood began to seep out. No longer in doubt about my diagnosis, I quickly drilled 2 more bore holes in a triangular pattern. Next, I fed a gilgly saw under the skull from one bore hole to another. After removing the protective plastic sheath from the gilgly's wire-like blade, I gripped the ends of the wire and pulled it back and forth in a sewing motion while exerting a steady upward pressure against the underside of the skull. After sewing through one side of the triangle, I threaded one end of my wire saw to the third hole and began cutting out a second side. I had to be careful to sew at an outward angle so that